G'day, mates. Nate the Aussie here. How you all doing? So I'm here. I'm here with another historical Asian martial arts contact of mine. So this is Just a Bug or Bug from the channel Just a Bug, Nathan. So we're going to be talking about the, I suppose, the sportification of historical martial arts in Asian historical Asian martial arts, as opposed to historical European martial arts, and looking at the differences and the nuances in between those. So this will be interesting. We'll have to see how this goes.
Why don't we tell the people about what we do and what our background is? So you run a club, don't you? You want to tell us about your club?
Yeah. So when I say club, it kind of it's not specifically a martial arts club. So we never claim to be a martial arts school or a martial arts club per se. For various reasons, but the one that we focus on predominantly is living history. So we're a living history group that focuses specifically on the years 1599 to 1600 in the Kyosu area of Japan. If you don't know where that is, it's basically just north of Nagoya. And what we do as a result, we basically study various aspects of the era using historical research, looking at things like the arts, the crafts, the food, the clothing, um, and so on, how people lived and so on, specifically within the context of a military retinue. And that means we also study the historical martial arts of that period as well. So, in that sense, we use, I suppose, what some people watching this video might think of as a HEMA like approach. So, you're looking at historical texts, manuals, and so on, and creating an historically valid interpretation of what combat would have looked like. So, we don't just do that, we do the other stuff as well for living history, but martial art research is a part of what we do, most definitely.
And where can people find you?
Yes, so we are based in Sunnybank Hills predominantly in Brisbane. We train in Les Atkinson Park and everything every Sunday. And generally speaking, we just focus on martial arts training as well as living history workshops, everything from how to hand make your sandals all the way through to how to make a personal cleaning kit in the field that's historically accurate. So that's generally what we do each week. Everything from that to even just having tea and discussing manuals and texts and stuff like that. So have an awesome time every Sunday. That's generally what we do.
Yeah,
But what about you, Nathan? Actually, so you run a club as well. Could
yeah,
you
so I do.
sort of explain to the mates what that is?
Yeah, so I run the Sydney Korean Historic Fencing over in Sydney. Um, and so we are a martial arts club. So we do historic Korean swordsmanship, looking at one of the manuals called Jerokum, and then we try and recreate it, put it through like the HEMA pressure testing and sparring, and then really seeing what works, what doesn't work, and why things don't work. So I think it's a good balance because we're the martial arts side, and then you're the art with the martial art as well. And it comes to the point of today's conversation. So all of the HEMA chats are
Mm,
having a talk about the sportification of HEMA in competitions, and so then they're
mm,
saying that all of the manual stuff and all of the martial arts stuff is now becoming a game, and we've got that in Asian martial arts too. Kendo being the key example. Striking
mm.
zones, points, rigid rules that just don't emulate history. So what are your thoughts on Kendo?
Yeah, I mean, Ken door is an interesting one because it's not the only door we have. We have Q door, we have
Mm,
EI door, a Bato door, if you also want to include that, and we also have Judo as well, right? And all of those have different sort of ways that they've evolved and developed through Japanese history. Kendo is an interesting one because it seems is predominantly it is a sport. And when I say sport, I'm not using that as a derogatory term because sometimes when people are thinking you're doing historical martial arts and you call something a sport, you're insulting it.
mm,
It's not an insult. It's a sport that basically is designed to improve yourself as a person through the practice of that sport, the scoring system, and so on, basically. So it has developed with that in mind. The mindset is not to teach you how to fight with a steel blade, and that's not a bad thing. That's just the goal that they have. And quite often, whenever you're looking at Kendo, a lot of the masters, the most honest ones that I've seen and I've spoken to, they all say, look, Kendo is all about improving yourself,
mm,
which matches with the word door, the way of something. Right? So it's improving yourself through the use of Ken, the sword. in that sporting context. So that's generally how I view Kendo in that sense.
Mm. Yeah, and look, I think that's a pretty good point that it's not about learning to fight with a sword. It's that you're improving yourself in the context of a sport because you look at other sports like modern Olympic Taekwondo, and it's not a fighting martial art anymore. There is an aspect of that there, but it's very much about improving yourself and playing the game. And if people enjoy that, look, all for it. That's fine.
Mm.
But
100%.
then I think that where we start running into trouble is where you've got things claiming to be historic martial arts, but actually are a sport. And I think that that's the whole thing with the HEMA competitions now, where you've got these people doing flick
Mm.
cuts and tappy weird stuff that and one-handed thrusts that weren't really a huge part of the manuals. Or necessarily
Mm.
the fighting system, but then because of the rule set, then it sort of gamifies it, and then these become the meta that wins.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. And I think obviously some do that less than others. Obviously,
Mm.
like I will mention to the viewers that we're not painting every single HEMA comp or
Oh, for
tournament
sure.
in
Yep.
the same light. But it can't be denied that there is a noticeable degree that it is getting heavily along the sportified side, almost, and I'm not saying it is the same, it is different, but almost the same, getting towards the direction of Kendall,
Mm.
but with steel blades,
Yeah.
almost. And which there's nothing wrong with that, for sure. And I'm all for people doing that if they enjoy that and they have fun and they get stuff out of it. But as you were saying, Nathan, I think honesty is key. I think the thing is that if you're doing that um, as the sport and you're playing within that specific rule set, which is based on making contact with a sword as opposed to cutting effectively and properly, then it starts to get a bit weird if we then muddy the waters and then claim that that is, I suppose, as close to the original historical martial arts as it was practiced.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that that's the current argument with HEMA. And look, I think we'll probably leave the how to fix that to a bit later. But I was also thinking that in Asian martial arts we've also got the opposite problem where we've got the martial
Mm,
arts being degraded to just an art and no martial there. And as far as from my Korean side, then we've got Haedong and Kumuye where
mm,
um, more of it is done swinging the sword through the air and spinning around than any practical applications or techniques, which is
mm,
fine. Like I said, if you want to do that and that's what gets you your exercise, that's what you enjoy, all for it. But then they claim that they come from the Muyadobu Tongji text, and it just doesn't. And that's where it really gets me because it's just this disingenuity there where they're trying to portray something that it's not, and it's not a martial art, it's an art. Um,
mm.
Japan's definitely got the same problem, don't they?
Yeah, and I've never understood. Like, I understand what people are trying to do when they do that, but I don't understand the real logical reason for that.
Mm,
Like, because again, I don't know much about Hidden Gumbo. I don't know much about that because it's not really in the, I suppose, the geographical area that I'm looking at. But I've never understood the reason for people who don't do something to try and then claim to be that something. Really, like I know it's self promotion. I get that. That's the reason. But other than that, there's not really any other reason,
yeah,
really.
and the
Like,
thing is,
there's
like,
nothing wrong.
yeah, the people who are doing it right, then they could just have the people who want to do that go to them rather than these people trying to edge over.
That's the thing, and it's like when, for example, I'm just going to use the head on gumbo just because that's what we
Hmm.
brought up. Um, like, if you're doing that, why not be honest about that and do that with integrity and be genuine about it and but why not do that? There's no real reason
Hmm.
to try and turn it into something it's not, other than for self gratification, because you're not providing the people who are looking for that thing they're looking
Hmm.
for, if you're doing that. So if you're doing stuff like that where you're trying to pretend what you're doing is something else that it really isn't, you're clearly not doing it for the benefit of the students. You're basically doing it for self promotion,
Yeah.
and that is not the most genuine venture, in my opinion. And that's why I don't really get, other than self promotion, I don't really get the logic behind it. There's no need to do that.
Yeah, yeah. Especially now, like I get it back in, the 1960s when no one was filling that market for the martial art. But Kumi is a new sport that's branched off from Hirongumdo, and they've done the same thing
Mm,
when there are people who are doing historic martial arts, and it just seems really it just doesn't seem right. It doesn't sit right with me because it seems like they're trying
mm,
to capture a wider market and deny these people the people they should be getting.
mm.
Um, but what's your view on Koryu as martial art compared to art?
Yeah. Now, look, I will phrase this very carefully because I know there's going to be some people who will strongly disagree with what I'm
Mm,
saying. And look, that's perfectly okay for people to disagree with me. At the end of the day, this is my opinion based on what I've seen, heard, and researched. Um, from what I've seen, the majority of Koryu, the goal is to preserve a lineage and curriculum. And that on its own is not a bad thing. I am all for people who want to preserve things, try and keep things the same. So it's like I suppose, almost like a timestamp, if you will, stuff like that. They want to preserve something that's very valuable to them. It's a cultural asset. I'm totally behind that. I think that's a great idea. Um, the only area where the caveat where I draw the line at with the majority of Koryu, not all, but the majority of Koryu, is that it is not about teaching you how to use the weapon in the same way it was used in the original context of the system.
mm,
And that again, that's not a bad thing. And I want to reiterate this again. It's not a bad thing if your priority is not about practical application of these against a resisting opponent. The bad thing starts when you are doing something that's only based on preserving a culture and passing it on, and then claiming it's also something else that it isn't.
mm,
So for me, the way I would see Koryu is again, it's something that most of the time, almost all the time, I would say, if not all the time, it's focusing on preserving a curriculum that's set and passing it on throughout the generations, so that it's preserved as a cultural treasure. And that's the way I see Koryu.
yeah, because my own experience with Kenjutsu was through, well, not even really Kenjutsu. It was Setei Ido. So, um, not even really
Mm,
Koryu. It's in the modern day and age.
yeah.
But I had two sensei there. One of them, then he said, "Look, this is preservation. This is for you to hone yourself, hone focus on the nuances of the form just because you can, and find out about yourself and
Mm,
how you move." And then the other one that she
mm,
was like, if you do this for long enough, you will know how to use a sword. And it really isn't.
mm,
The 12 forms of Satiyada, I've done a fair few years of sparring, and I've never felt the need to use any of them because they're from these contexts that never happen. You're sitting with a katana length blade opposite someone else who's got a katana length blade. Why are you sitting with a katana length blade? It just things like
mm.
that. It's not going to happen. So I
Yeah,
like the
yeah.
honesty of the male sensei. But yeah, that's my experience.
Yeah, EI is a tricky thing because it's one of those things that tends to be done a lot in various Koryu today. I mean, if we're looking at Katori Shintoryu, sorry, if I say the full name, Tenshin Soden Katori Shintoryu, they have this huge curriculum on this quite significant curriculum on EI.
Mm,
And if you want to include Tenshin Yu Hyoho as well in that, that's a bit of a sort of debate on that. But if you wanted to include Tenshin Yu Hyoho as well, they've got a gigantic curriculum on draws. But then when you look at the Sengoku period, which is basically from 1460 all the way through to, I would say, 1650, maybe 1630 if you include the Shimabara Rebellion, um, the EI is not very common at
mm,
all. It is mentioned on the occasion. The most EI I have ever seen mentioned is from Yamamoto Kansuke, and I think he mentions three, maybe four. and they're very generic. It's not until the Edel period that people start going crazy on EI. And again, that doesn't mean EI is dumb. That doesn't mean EI has no use. That's not what we're saying. But it tends to get blown out of proportion a lot in terms of its use in history, particularly in the Sengoku period. And so when we're looking at things like Idol, it's weird, yeah, because you see these videos on YouTube sometimes where it's like Hema versus the Idol, and you're like, why compare that? It makes no sense. But yeah, it's a weird one for sure.
Yeah, and look, I think that brings up an interesting point about the disproportionality of, um, EI compared to other techniques after in more peacetime eras, because I tend to see the same thing being done with a lot of the Korean swordsmanship as well. And my
Mm,
theory for it is because when you look at the manuals don't talk about basics very much. Because why would they? Everyone knows the basics, so
mm,
who cares, right? And so then the Asian manuals, from my experience with dealing with them, seems to be here's a list of these advanced techniques that will work. But then if you don't have the basics to then interpret the advanced techniques because you're 500 years later into the future, you can make some pretty weird and wacky assumptions and pretty weird and wacky interpretations. Um,
definitely, yeah.
yeah, and then
It's
if that's your book of manuals, that's your book of techniques, and that's all you got to use, well, you get some pretty interesting fighting too.
Yes, and I think that's the other thing as well is that obviously anyone, whatever your background, if you want to have a look at these manuals and you want to just like have some interpretations, think of some interpretations for fun, just because it's fun, sure, obviously go nuts. But if you don't have a martial arts background and you don't have a background as well that has dealt with weapons before and
Mm.
sparred, you're going to come up with some very weird interpretations. And that's nothing against you. It's just that you don't have experience in that thing. So that is definitely something as well that can affect it for sure.
And I think though that if you come up with a weird interpretation, there's actually nothing wrong with that as long as you just pressure test with other people who don't do your weird interpretation, because then it'll all come out in the
Mm,
wash. You'll find out what doesn't work, what does
definitely.
work, and you'll just continue to hone it unless you say, no, this is the technique and therefore I cannot change it and this way must work. Then we start to run into troubles as well, don't we?
Yes. And this popped up in a conversation that I had with Jem, another living history, historical martial arts mate of mine, and Aiden, who I do living history and HEMA with, as well as Kieran from Kinjutsu Sparring Club. Uh, the discussion came up where it's talking about, oh, our moves are too dangerous to pressure test. And this sense that as soon as we hear that, immediately alarm bells start to go off.
Yeah.
Because if you are using that, it sounds a lot like a I don't want to have to try and pressure test my techniques. I'm just going to pull this get out of jail free card. I don't need to pressure test it because I know it works. And that's when things start to get real weird. Is then you're not willing to spar, you're not willing to refine, you're not willing to pressure test, and even possibly admit you're wrong.
Mm. And to be fair though, I think that the argument of our techniques are too dangerous to pressure test may have held weight before HEMA gear came out. After
For
HEMA gear
sure.
came out, there's no real excuse anymore, except for
Yeah.
if your technique involves, joint locks or, throwing someone to the ground, then okay, yes, maybe. Maybe there are
Mm.
some things there where you probably need a bit more control, but everything else, you sort of can.
Yeah, I mean, I'd still argue you still need control even with protected
Oh,
gear,
yes, for sure, for sure.
of course, but I do agree, yes, that obviously things like joints and stuff, obviously there's a different element to that. But yeah, I agree. It's obviously before protective gear comes in, maybe it holds a bit of weight, but now in today's world, not really.
Not
No.
really, no. Yeah, Hemi gears. Also, Hemi gears come a long way too. We're not using these old gambesons where if a blade snaps, then it runs you through, and these blades that have a 20-kilo flex on them. We've got safe weapons now.
No, but that's the thing, though, right? Like it's advanced so much because people have been using it so
Mm,
much, and
yep.
because it's been pressure tested. Again, we go back to pressure testing everyone, but like it's been pressure tested over time. It's been refined, and people have put reviews in, and because of that, it's further refined. Um, So even when it comes to sparring kit, people need to be willing to pressure test.
Oh yeah, for
It
sure.
all comes back to pressure testing.
Yeah, yep, yep. Um, Yeah, so with regards to pressure testing though, then I think then we start flowing into the sportification. And I recently saw this argument against, it was in the Chinese sword Discord, where there was a person who posted a video of a person using a sparring gen versus a person using a European saber in HEMA kit. And
Mm,
it was a good bout. And there was one technique where the gen guy got a thrust in. Um, and then the people were saying, oh no, this is the sportification of the martial art because they use floppy blades that have pointer balances that aren't wrong and they're too light. And the HEMA kit then it restricts your movement. I thought these people probably have never held the HEMA weapons or HEMA kit because they've gotten really good. You could have said that,
mm,
a few years back, but no, they've gotten really good now.
mm. Yeah, and I mean, look, the argument where a certain weapon doesn't represent or is not close enough to what it originally represents is a valid critique to
Mm,
an extent. Like, for example, if there's a club that's only using buffers or only using shinai
yeah.
and then claiming they know how to fight with steel weapons, obviously then it's a valid critique because they do not represent steel weapons at all. Um, but at the same time, but then when you get things like that where people are using steel and yeah, they've got some flex, but otherwise they're not floppy noodles. And then you have people saying, oh, therefore it's not. Yeah, I think then it starts to get a bit trickier. I think it very much depends on can you use the weapon in its primary functions in a way where the weapon doesn't lose integrity, aka become too floppy or something like that. So, for
Mm.
example, when you're working with a long sword where you need to work from the bind sometimes, and the sword is so floppy that it just doesn't work in that at all, then okay, sure, maybe that critique has some weight. But otherwise, I don't really see the point of trying to make these, oh, it's too sporty kind of claims.
Yeah, and look, I think the if you look back in the day when Regenye had the longsword light and the longsword strong feather, where it was 6 kilos flex
Mm,
and 15 kilos flex and nothing in between. Yeah, it
fine by
was
me.
it wasn't great. Whereas now that everywhere, I think most people have got the balance right. Where for a decent longsword length blade, then 12 kilo flex or so will do. You can really do everything you want, and it just works. And then now that technology's been developed, you look at Asian sparring swords, and you can get Asian sparring swords with the right flex. There are even companies like Black Fencer where you can take an antique sword that you've got, or even a
Mm,
non-antique sword that you've got, and you can just send them the dimensions. You can be like, "Can you make this as a sparring version?" And they'll do it, and they'll make it
mm,
with safe flex that still keeps enough rigidity to it that it works well. And
mm.
there's really no excuse not to pressure test anymore.
Yeah, 100%. Which I think is a great idea,
Hmm.
having that as an option, is sending in an antique blade and say, hey, look, I'd like this, but it's for sparring, and they're able to make, I like work that through with you. I think that's a great idea.
Yeah. Now, going back to the sportification side of things, I think the sportification of HEMA in terms of historic fencing, the way that I see it, and look, I may be wrong, is that the rule sets and the scoring of the competitions leads to people who want to win and not do the historic martial arts, but want to win to then do a certain move set that then makes them win. For example, if you've got a rule set that penalizes afterblows, right, and gives way to the right of way instead, then you've got these people who will stick out their thing and start lunging, and they'll just keep on going with it because that way then you're chasing it, and they'll completely ignore any hits that are coming at them because they've got right of way. Or if you've got the
Mm,
opposite, where you've got things where they don't give the right of way and they penalize the afterblow, then you've got people who, if they get hit, they'll just afterblow everything because who cares if I'm dead because I'm not really dead. It's a competition.
mm,
Um, and then even just where you're scoring for hits alone, then you've got everyone who's trying to get the fastest, flickiest hit that you can because it's safer to. It's faster. You can definitely land a
mm.
flicky hit to the hands much easier than you can do a well set up, thrust to the chest. Um, do you think we've got any danger of going in that direction with the Asian martial arts?
I think there's always danger of that anywhere in the world, in
Hmm.
any kind of martial art, I think. Asian is not separate from that. Um, I think it would take a while to get there,
Mm,
probably longer than it has in Europe, just because historical martial arts in various Asian countries, in China, Korea, particularly Japan, um, tends to have that strong cultural element. And because in Japan, there are the weapons laws where you can't have steel weapons, and unless it's a properly made katana by a proper made katana smith, swordsmith, and then it'll be made sharp. And no one's gonna want to spend over like $10,000 on a sword just to blunt it,
yeah.
um, and and have a weapon they can't really use anyway. So I think there is danger of it happening, but I think it would take longer to get there.
Mm,
Um, Especially, I think, because it's such a niche area, the area of historical Asian martial arts done in steel sparring with the similar research methodology as HEMA,
mm.
but for historical Asian. It's such a niche area that I think it'll take some time to happen, but I think that it will definitely happen eventually.
Yeah. And I mean, we barely even have competitions, don't we? Because I think the only one that I can think of that was a worldwide tournament was the one in France last year. That's the only one that
Oh
comes
yeah,
to
that was the
mind.
one held by Alex's group, wasn't it?
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
the Honor Arms and the Ocado sponsored it with Jeff Beeson sponsoring it. Yeah,
that's right.
yeah,
Yeah, I remember now. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
yeah. Because to date, that's the only big worldwide Asian sword tournament that I can think of, and hopefully it's not going to stay that way. But yeah.
Hmm. It's definitely the only one that has steel fencing
Mm,
for sure. Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's an interesting one, I suppose, because the thing is with sport in at least in Japan, you've already got sportified fencing. That's kendo,
mm,
um, and kendo's rule sets. If you're looking at it from a practical martial arts perspective, it's very weird. Um, Doubles happen all the time, but it's not always penalized really in a way. There's a bunch of weird stuff that goes in with there, and you also have to yell certain parts when you go for them as well. So it's already there. The question is, I don't know. Now that more people are getting into historical Asian fencing, Japanese included, particularly now that Akudo Armory is around,
mm.
uh, when you get the people who do HEMA looking at that and go, "Oh, I like that," and then you get the sporty types coming in, yeah, what's that going to turn into? Is it going to turn into Kendo but with steel, or is it? Yeah, hmm,
Yeah, yeah.
interesting.
And I guess then it comes to, how do we make because if you don't penalize doubles, then you just end up with messy fencing all around. And then I
Yeah,
I
one
guess
hundred
it comes
percent.
down to how do you make a rule set that makes a decent game that everyone who plays it still is in this martial arts bracket, not a too sporty, not a too weird and arty. It's just martial
Mm,
arts.
yeah, definitely. And like, I think I'll use an example. I won't mention the group, but there was a group that I was with in Taiwan. They do HEMA, and they were also working with Yoseikan Budo as well, which is also based in Taiwan. And I know one of the senseis who works in that school. Really friendly guy, awesome guy. Kevin's his name. If you're watching this, Kevin, hi. They basically hosted me and allowed me to just take part in some kind of practice that they were working on for the first kind of tournament they were running. And the tournament was meant to work in a way that you could have Yoseikan people take part, as well as HEMA, and award, or I suppose provide incentive for a more dynamic fighting system that included grapples, takedowns, hand strikes, leg strikes, as well as strikes with the weapon.
Hmm.
Which look, in a sense, on its own, I like that idea. I think it's cool. If it's done properly, I think it has potential. The downside, though, was that weapon strikes, and these are swords, weapon strikes and hand strikes and leg strikes were all worth 1 point. And each
Hmm.
round was a total of 5 points. Now they tried to limit it by saying you can only rack up 2 points maximum with hand strikes. So you can't just go one, two, three, four, five, six. You can just do two, and that's it. You can't do more. But the problem was, is these were continuous fencing. It didn't stop. So
Hmm.
you'd have a guy take a full-on hit to his forearm with a sword, and he just shrugs it off, goes straight in for the grapple.
Mm.
And to me, that was a really weird rule set. And I made that clear to them. I said, look, I think there are better ways to do this. And they did acknowledge it. They're like, look, it's our first time doing it. Yeah, there's probably better ways of doing it. We'll refine it. But I just found that rule system really weird. Um,
Yeah. I guess the because the other thing is that I tell people everyone who comes to my club that swords are not a weapon that you can eat a hit from and continue. It's if you're not in armor, it doesn't really work. You can't just continue on. So I find it really interesting because in that rule set, then you could eat a hit with the sword and then go in for a 1-2 combo and actually get more points by the 1-2 combo compared to the sword guy who's just cut you down.
well, that's the thing. And what I found was a bit silly was that it meant that there was no point on delivering proper cuts from
Mm,
measure. It didn't really award that. And it also didn't award grappling done properly either. It just awarded suicidal charges,
mm,
which, if we're looking at proper grappling with weapons, is not the way you should do it. And the way I thought it was better, it would be better, is that if it actually incentivized, if you want to grapple, fine, but you need to do it in a way that you don't eat a sword hit on the way in.
yeah,
If you do, the grapple's failed, and if you get a good hit from a sword, okay, the bout ends. I don't know, unless it's like a superficial, I don't know, little nick to the, I don't know, the calf or something. But like otherwise, yeah, because otherwise, what's the point of hitting with the sword?
yeah. And I guess it's interesting that you bring in that it favors where you've got the points just for striking and landing a hit no matter what it is, then it favors the suicidal doubles and suicidally going in because that's sort of what I see with kendo. Um, because
Mm.
I had a friend who was quite high level in kendo in the competition scene, and he used to tell me that because the neck's not a striking zone, then what you can do is when they strike for your head, you can dodge and eat it on your neck to strike their head, and then therefore they haven't struck a striking zone and you struck a striking zone, so you've got the point. And I said, but you're dead. But by the rule set, you've won.
Yeah, and I mean, look, I think like within a Kendo context, people who are doing Kendo for Kendo and stuff like that, obviously, no problem. If you found
Yeah,
a way to cheese the system,
fair
sure, go
enough.
nuts. I mean, I would do the same if I had
It
the
takes
option.
athleticism to
Um,
do that too, as well. Like, not
yeah,
let's
yeah,
not get
oh,
that wrong.
of course, but at the same time, this and again, this comes back to the honesty that we were talking about before, right? It's like if you're doing that, sure, whatever, go nuts, but then don't claim that because you do that, you therefore know how to fight with steel blades,
Mm,
because that's a whole other thing.
yeah,
What you know, if you're highly trained in kendo, is you know how to move very quickly, and you know how to fight very well in that system, which is fine. That's all
which is
cool,
fine.
but it's not the same as fighting with steel blades.
Yeah, yeah. And I guess that's the other thing is that all of the other sports, it's fighting in a system. Whereas what we do is not really fighting in a system, it's trying to fight, you know, everyone else's system as
Mm.
well, which is then what makes it rather interesting.
Yeah, definitely. And I think the other difference as well between what I do and, for example, someone like the poor historian, Jerry, does, is Jerry focuses on usually a specific text and then tries to, I suppose, not recreate, but try and demonstrate the techniques from that text. He
Mm,
looks at other texts too, but he focuses on predominantly one, which is all fine, especially if you're running like a martial arts club.
mm,
But for what my group's doing, which is a living history group, um, we can't, and we're trying to portray what combat would have likely looked like. We can't really use only one source because at the time, everyone in our area wasn't going, okay, where's the Heiho Kadensho? I can't learn how to fight until I've read that text. Like, no one was thinking that. People would have had various different backgrounds, and those backgrounds would have been influenced on what was available at the time. So, what we have to do is we have to develop an approach that uses combinations from various period texts and then create a single I suppose, picture, if you will, of what combat would have likely looked like by combining them all together. So
Yeah.
it's not focusing on only one text or trying to create one system or recreate one system. It's more trying to get a picture of what the combat likely looked like,
Hmm.
which is a whole other
That's a
thing.
whole other ball game because, for me, it's a little bit easier because I run a martial arts club where I say we do Jedokum and that's all I need to focus on. Whereas you sort of got to
Mm,
look at a bit more of the time period and saying what's in the time period, isn't it? Because it'd be
mm,
the way that I see what you do is it's like if we said, how did writing look like in the 1700s? Well, we can't just look at
mm,
English.
mm,
That's not the only language that's around. You have to look at all of the different languages and
mm.
see what writing looked like in the 1700s. Whereas my
Well,
job is easy.
yeah.
I say, what does English look like in the 1700s? Boom.
Well, no, exactly, and it's also this idea of um, if when we're looking at how combat looked, we can't just look at the way one guy does it because not everyone was Control C, Control V of that guy.
Mm,
Everyone is different. Everyone had their own backgrounds, and not only that, you would be having guys learning from some other guy who is experienced, and then they go onto the battlefield and then they see someone else doing something, and they go, "Oh, I like that," and they incorporate that in what they do, and it would have been this mishmash of stuff that would have been a mishmash of what was being done at that time. So when we're trying to say we're trying to show what combat would have likely looked like at the time, we can't really do that by only using one source because that would kind of be like trying to say, okay, we are going to try and show what everyone in the 21st century in Brisbane was thinking by only looking at one person's writing. It,
yeah,
it doesn't really make sense.
doesn't really make sense. Yeah, yeah, yeah. I guess then the question though that we had about the sportification was how do we make sure that it doesn't happen to us? And then people have also come up with the argument of what about a subjective rule set? So if we take away points and scoring as an objective rule set, how about if we grade people
Mm.
on how they look, how historic they look, how the setup and all of that? What do you think about that?
Um, I seem to remember this popped up in a Discord at one point. I seem to remember you mentioning something like this. It, I think there's merit to it. Um, but I also think that it needs to be very clearly defined.
Mm,
Because I'm I don't know, I'm thinking about this from a teaching perspective. But like if I'm marking a student's work, it's really good if we know exactly what the criteria means and looks like.
mm,
Because if the criteria is something super vague, like student shows uh, comprehensive and detailed such and such of such and such. Well, what does comprehensive and detailed mean
what does
on
it
paper?
mean? Right.
Yeah, and I think when we're going back to martial arts, it's like, do you look like you're moving and fighting in a way that is described in the text is fine, as but we need to define exactly what that means
What that
first.
means. Yeah, yeah. That actually brings me to an interesting side note about the clear definition. Because have you seen any Ido tournament?
Not first hand, no. I've seen videos.
Mm.
Why is that?
So the point graded on things like how zen they look, how
Mm,
well they move and things like that. And there's no, it's interesting because it's completely that thing of, well, what exactly does it mean? What are we looking for? Because I found it really interesting because
mm.
they don't even all have to be doing the same form. Because they don't
Right.
they could be
Yeah, yeah,
doing
yeah,
their Koryu school with their other forms, not the Seite 12 forms, and still be in the same competition as the Seite 12 forms, but they're graded on how they move and how they look. And this it's I found that really interesting. But look, that was a bit of a side note. Um,
yeah. Mm.
yeah, I thought of an interesting rule set that I do want to try to apply if I were to run a competition
Mm.
for historic fencing, um, which is a mix of both objective and subjective rule sets. So how it goes is that you've got one judge for one competitor, and that judge obviously can't be affiliated with that competitor. They've for the
Mm.
objective side, then they award hits. and they have some way to take away points for hits received, whether that's after
Mm,
blow, on first intention, whatever. It's anytime you get hit, you get points docked.
mm,
And then on the subjective criteria, then there's only three things. So, how was the structure of your attack? Did it look like there would actually be some power in there, and that you can actually put a decent cut through, or is it this weird, flick with nothing to it?
mm,
How's the setup? Did you set up that attack well, or was it suicidal? Pretty much. And then finally
mm,
is, does it look like it's something that is conducive with your movement set, that it looks like it belongs in your historic system?
mm. Yeah, 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 yeah. I like the idea of having one judge per combatant. Um, that makes it a lot easier because obviously when we're looking at this rule set for the first time, the first thought people are going to think of is, "Whoa, how the hell do you keep track of all of this?"
Mm,
Which was one of the things that this group from Taiwan brought up was we had to have something very simple. So the 1 points each made it easy to track, which I get. But I like the idea of breaking things down and I suppose having the dedicated focus of each person. So this judge, okay, you're only focusing on this guy. This judge, you're only focusing on this guy. You can have two linemen as well. Things where it's heavily broken up, so that way the complexity is divvied up.
mm.
Um, and if you're also stopping the bout for a strong hit, all right, it also means that you don't have to keep counting points in your head as the fight keeps going,
I don't
which you
think
do have to
continuous
do
fencing
in a
is good.
continuous bout.
Yeah, I don't think continuous fencing is good. I just don't think it's. I think in terms of a realism perspective, yes, sure. But in terms of an actual clean fencing, it just leads to messy fencing all around. That's what I think.
I would argue that I agree. I agree. I think that, however, if we were going to do continuous fencing in a very realistic way, very few continuous fencing bouts I've seen actually do it. Because
Mm,
whenever it's continuous fencing, it just becomes a slog match of who can take however many
yep.
whoever can get to this amount of points first. Whereas in reality, continuous fencing would literally mean I eat a shot with my forearm, I lose my arm, I go, ah, and then they then follow up with another cut, I fall to the ground, and then they finish me off on the ground. That's what continuous fencing would be.
Yes.
Uh,
Yes.
but when are people going to start doing that?
Well, when are people going to lose limbs in a competition? Never. So it just doesn't
No, no,
work.
no. I more mean like people aren't gonna. I don't know. I don't imagine people being able to convincingly show or pretend that their arm has fallen off. It's just gonna look really weird. Like
Yeah.
you weren't convincing enough. Your arm has been chopped off. Your acting skills are shit.
Now
Or
we're
I don't
diving
know.
into reenactment, aren't we?
Yeah, it just it creates a weird picture. So no, I agree. Continuous fencing is probably not the best to do, especially in terms of just the flow and just keeping track of things. I like the rule set that you've shown in that aspect. It'd be cool to see what it looks like. To be honest, have you done that in your school
No,
yet?
not
Or
yet. And the other thing is, well, my key problem with this is that you can apply any rule set to my school, because they've all been brainwashed to do clean fencing. I've hammered into all of them. You have to
mm,
fence clean doubles of the enemy. There's no point in eating a hit to give a hit. It doesn't work. So any rule set that you give them, because it's a club tournament. No one's there to win, right? Um,
mm,
then any rule set will work. So we really have to test this with people who have on their agenda, I have to win at all costs because I need to win this
mm,
tournament.
mm. Yeah, no, that's a good point. Yeah, I see what you're saying. It'd be interesting to see how that goes. Get people who pretty much only do sporting competitions with feathers,
Hmm.
and get
And
them
then
to
see
do
what they
this.
do.
That would be interesting. Interesting for sure. So would there be a matter of before the tournament, the judges sit down and agree on what looks historical and what doesn't?
It's not so much about
Um,
what looks historical as in from the books, but it's when you see somebody move, right? You can sort of
mm,
see where there's a movement that's out of place. Where you see the German fencers and they've got the nice wide guards, their clear defined movements, and then suddenly out of nowhere, then a one hand thrust just comes out. You're like, look, it works, but is that would I say that that's the most historically accurate technique from the manuals? Probably not. Um,
mm. it's tricky because then the counter argument to that, just playing devil's advocate here, would maybe be something like, oh, but are we saying that people at the time wouldn't have done that? What do we mean when we say historically accurate?
Mm, yeah, I guess so. Because I guess the thing is though that the way that I look at uh, historic fencing is that most of the techniques are there designed so that you've got some options out of it. And then some of these techniques, then they
Mm.
don't have options out of it because they're in the context of, well, in this competition, I'm not going to die. And so then I genuinely think
Mm.
that yes, one-handed thrusts probably were thrown, but I don't think they were thrown as readily as they are in competitions today. Because in competitions today, if you fail the one-handed thrust, well, I might lose a point if I can't recover in time. In a historic duel, if you fail the one-handed thrust,
Mm.
it's that and you can't recover in time to get your sword back in time. That's a big downside that you're eating on that.
Yeah, I think the negative aspects of something like that, in terms of like the consequences of if you do a cheesy thing like that, would be acted upon if the other person knows how to respond to it. I
That's true.
think if the person keeps doing it in a match, but they keep getting away with it, that onus is actually more on the other
On the
person.
other person, I would agree with that because I would say if they can consistently do it, right? I would
Mm.
say that's in keeping with their moveset and in keeping with their movement patterns, and I would actually award them that point because it may not be from a manual as such, but
Mm.
they've clearly come up with a style that works pressure tested against other people who are fighting with, techniques of the time that works. And whether it's a modern
Mm.
interpretation or just, techniques that work, who cares? I'd say it works with their moveset. It's more penalizing the ones that don't work with people's movesets that you can clearly see that this is something, yes, I've gamed the system, I'm throwing this in here, doesn't match with everything else.
Yeah, yeah, no, I get what you mean. I think the key would be is making sure that all the judges are on the exact same page
Mm,
with that, because obviously there's a lot more. You're allowing for a lot more subtleties, which I'm a fan of because these subtleties need to be allowed for. But I think that yeah, a key thing would be to make sure that all the judges are all on point with exactly what things mean. Obviously, maybe even have some practice runs so the judges can practice applying
mm.
that as well. Um, so then that way, if anything happens on the day, there is no matter of, I don't know, there's no room for debate on
Yeah.
what the criteria is.
I mean, ideally, if it were a big enough tournament, then I'd actually like five judges per competitor, and then we just exclude the top and the bottom results, so we just take the middle three. That way, then, but then you need 10
Yeah, yeah,
judges for
yeah.
a tournament, and most tournaments can barely even get two, so that's its own trouble, isn't it?
So actually, you know what's funny? This opens up another topic, which because look, I agree, it's good to have that many, but what if? Hear me out. What if there are tournaments that allow for melees,
It'll
and then
allow for
sorry?
what, sorry?
So what about tournaments that allow for melees?
Like,
So group melees,
mm.
and because that'd be a whole other kettle of fish. Because you can't have 5 people per person. Because if you have a melee of 15 people, all right, that's 50 times 5 judges.
Yeah,
Like I don't know,
it's
that'd
only
be
five
interesting
judges.
to have that. But I'd love that because if we're opening this up to more historically valid context, then that would also include things like pike walls
Mm.
and things like that. And then it's like, ooh, okay, how is that done? How are we going to do that? So that'd be an interesting thing for us to have to deal with in the future if it did happen.
To be fair though, I don't actually care to train that much in melees with the people in my club because I thought I would, and then once when my club got big enough that we could do multiple opponents, I just realized that it's less about technique of the individual fencer, it's about cardio and how many friends you've got, and that's about it.
Um, I don't know. Like as someone I agree, cardio definitely is a big part of it, 100%. And having friends, I know we know the hematuridices. There is a technique that has friends. Bring your friends. Um, but I would say, in addition to that, it does still come back to technique. It just comes into how you apply the technique. Because we do drills in our group where we work with multiple opponents in an area. and we sort of base it, we scaffold it, we make it really easy at first, where they literally just walk to you with their point forward. And then we keep it. We call it zombie drill. It's an idea that I've gotten from IKMF training, which is it was a really cool idea. We just keep introducing more and more zombies. So eventually, you have five people walking towards you with their points, and you deflect it, and they wait a couple seconds, and then they just come back around at you again,
Hmm.
basically. And it's trying to introduce the idea of after you perform a technique, a deflection, and a counter, where do you move after that?
Hmm.
And how do you get there? And how do you get there in a safe and efficient manner, keeping in mind there's more than one opponent? So I would argue that even with multiple opponents, while it doesn't become as much of a technique game as it would be against a 1v1, I would still argue that technique does come into it. It's just that the way you use the technique and relate to the technique is different, because then you have to think about where am I moving to after this to then deal with another threat? Where do I move in a way that positions myself in a safer way against more than one opponent?
Hmm. Yeah, look, I think that's fair. I think that's fair, and I think it's. I wouldn't say that that's so much technique. I would say that's more tactics, and it's a tactics game. Especially when you've now got multiple people against multiple people, then it's how do we, after they've done their technique, where do you move them to next? Is the bigger game of what wins.
I would, that is true, particularly for the person commanding the formation.
Hmm.
If you're in the formation, it's as speaking from experience, the things you focus on more are not just your own techniques, basic techniques of being able to parry, riposte, and so on, but then also how you work together with the people next to you.
Hmm.
And I would still argue that that is a technique.
Fair enough.
It's more tactical in terms of its approach, just because you have to think about more than just one person. But the way I see it, it's still technique. It's just that the way you're applying the technique and the way you're applying the concepts, the martial concepts that go along with those techniques, are adapted to
Hmm.
the new situation. I think if that makes sense. But I would be really keen to see that in tournaments. That'd be cool.
I
I'd love
think
to see that.
the way that I would see a melee tournament play out, though, that I would love to see it play out is that you die if you get two hits to the limbs or one hit to a deep target, head or torso, right? And then
Mm.
you run back to a respawn point. You have to tap the respawn point, and then you respawn and you run back in. And it's just time based, right? And then it's just see whose team racked up the most deaths and they lose. That is how I would
That would
see
be fun.
a melee tournament being done.
No,
And
but you see what I mean? There are so many variations. You can have capture the flag variants too.
mm,
You can have protect the VIP.
yep, yep,
There are various different options you could do that are group melee themed. It's not just formation. You could
yeah.
have other stuff like that too. Um, yeah, that'd be fun. That'd be a whole other thing because I don't know. That's not really something that's done. But anyway, that's just the living history person in me talking. I just find that cool. I send for formations. Deal with it.
Uh, I think that's a cool point where living history encompasses the martial arts, but also goes up so much more than what we do. And I always find that really cool with what you do.
Thanks, man. No, it's. I don't think it's more. I just think it's different.
Hmm.
I think the more is the culture and the food and the clothing, and the clothing does affect the fencing, by the way.
Yes, yes.
Um, but the thing that we don't have as much of is being able to, if you only do living history and nothing else, is being able to thrust towards the face because open face helmets. And that's a dynamic that some people in living history don't get. And so they then, if they're only doing living history, develop these weird fencing systems where they don't protect their face because they know they can cheese it.
Hmm.
So upside downsides for sure, but it's
That's
fun.
a current thing going on in the Sticks and Steel Facebook page with a lot of the
Mm,
Viking Western tournaments, and they've got
mm.
no hits to their head, no hits to the hands, I believe, which for most of HEMA is 75% of the targets taken away, right?
Mm. Yeah, yeah. Look, I have my own opinion on how to do that within cultures that had helmets, but helmets were not always the majority.
Hmm.
Um, but yeah, it is a weird topic. Eh?
Yeah. I mean, the thing is that even in historic fencing and HEMA, we've got no strike zones. You can't strike to the back or the back of the head, because you're going to
Okay.
seriously injure somebody. But at my
Mm.
club, then if you just indicate it, it's stop. Yep, you've got the point. That's it. I think you can still play it with an indication.
Oh, for sure, 100%.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, definitely, definitely. So actually, I have a question for you.
Yeah.
So in terms of, because we already talked about Kendo, in Korea, is there an equivalent to that? Because obviously we know people in Korea do Kendo,
Yes.
but is there a Korean equivalent to Kendo
Yeah. So
specifically?
that actually brings us to a very interesting point about swordsmanship in Korea. So
Mm,
all modern swordsmanship in Korea, with the exception of Shibaki, which is the 18 arts, which is the 18 non-horseback arts in the Muedo Tongji, which are the manuals,
yeah.
they're all Japanese. It's actually all just Japanese martial. It's all just Japanese swordsmanship because
Mm,
in Korea, then there was a Japanese colonial period, and they banned Korean swordsmanship. And they
right.
replaced it with Japanese swordsmanship. So the kendo equivalent in Korea
Mm.
is gumdo, which is quite literally the same ken, gum, do. It's quite
Right.
literally
Yeah.
the same
Gotcha.
thing, and it is kendo with kendo rule sets. Um, and then you've got other things like Heron Gumdo, which is kenjutsu essentially. And
Mm,
it's Japanese swordsmanship through and through. The swords that they use, the techniques that they use, with the exception of some of the spins and things like that, which are a more newer addition with influence from Hapkido, which is also Aikido.
mm,
Note same thing. Then
mm,
it's Japanese swordsmanship through and through. So in modern Korea, there is no Korean swordsmanship. Shibpalki is the exception where it doesn't come from Japan. So Shibpalki was where there was a Korean kung fu practitioner, and he
okay.
got hold of the Muay Double Tongji, the manuals of the Korean martial arts from the Joseon Dynasty, and he recreated
Mm,
them from a kung fu perspective. And so that
mm,
it's somewhat Korean. It's got a very different flavor to it for how he interprets the manuals compared to how I interpret the manuals, because
mm,
there's no pressure testing. Um, but at least it's truly Korean historic martial arts with a base in history, whereas Haedongumdo, Kumuye, they come from Japanese martial arts, but then they retcon their history and they tie it back to I'm pretty sure Haedongumdo says that they come from Bongkukgum, which Bongkukgum is one of the
mm,
manuals in Muay Double Tongji. Um, and none of the forms of Bongkukgum can be seen in Haedongumdo ever. It doesn't happen. Kumuye, then they say they
right.
come from Sangsudo, which, if you know about Sangsudo, is a 1.8-meter long, ginormous sword that Qi Jiguang introduced to Korea during the Joseon Dynasty. They do that with a
Mm,
katana, and none of the forms look like the Sangsudo forms because you move the swords in very different ways. So it's a retcon history it's just not genuine. Yeah, it's all
mm,
Japanese swordsmanship in essence.
hmm. So they basically, this is a bit of a jab, but they basically did what Eric Shahan does to Chinese texts. Oh, these are all look Japanese. I'm just going to assign them Japanese names.
Yeah, pretty much. Except it's that these were made in the 1960s or so, where there was a big boom for martial arts making money. So it wasn't even just so much of Shahan's thing of going, I want there to be more Japanese influence text. It's just quite literally, I can make a lot of money from this, and they were
Mm,
very successful. You've even got
mm,
courses with Heron Gumdo and Kumuye where you can pay to skip colored belts, things like that. So
mm,
um, it's not my favorite, but I do think that it still creates a good place for people who want to swing a sword and feel like they're involved in modern Korean culture and get some exercise done. Great for that. Fantastic.
mm, yeah. Okay. Yeah. That's interesting because Japan hasn't doesn't really have that to the same extent in
Hmm.
terms of like things being stopped and things being started up that are from another country but then claiming to be this, or like Japan doesn't really have that as much as Korea does, is something I've noticed.
Yeah.
Because
So
Korea's in that awkward position where it's geographically and martially and culturally in between Japan and China because of where it's situated. So it's yeah, it's interesting to hear that background, to be honest, because it's very different to Japan.
it's not even just where Korea is situated geographically. It's who did Korea belong to? Joseon Dynasty belonged to China. Japanese colonial period, obviously, Japan. So,
Well, that's right.
and then
Yeah.
and then there's active influence from Japan in the Japanese colonial period to do that. So there is Japan's hand in there that's sort of just trickling through to the modern day as well.
Mm. It's interesting actually because there's a running theory based on some of the research, and I find it's a pretty plausible theory to be honest, based on what research we have, and it's that the culture in Japan of horse archers for the samurai, a bunch of that was influenced by Korean nobility refugees from the kingdom of I don't know how to pronounce it, Baekje or something
Baek,
like
yeah,
that.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah, when they fled there because they were allied with the Japanese government at that time
Mm,
against other Korean states and their ally Tang Dynasty China. And because because horse archery was very much a thing in Korea,
yeah.
so there's a theory that they actually brought that over. So if that's true, and in my opinion it is plausible, it could be said that quite a lot of what we think of as samurai horse archery, a lot of it is actually Korean
Korean
influence.
plus.
So that's interesting.
Interesting question about that. What bows do they use for the horse archery?
So they predominantly use the Yumi, so the
Like
Japanese longbow tradition.
the long in the same form as you see in Kyudo, is it the really long ginormous ones?
It is the long ones. I don't think they're the same ones they would use for Kyudo,
Mm,
but the same design. It's still the Yumi, the
mm,
longbow.
mm. Because
It's not. Oh yeah.
oh, I was going to say that, in Korea, the bows developed for horse archery, becoming these very short bows specifically designed for horse archery. Whereas in Japan, then it seems like they've gone the other way, where they've gone for the not breaking and no less hand shock type thing.
Yeah, well, there's an old uh, carving or painting. I can't remember what it is, but it is from the I think it's the Jomon period in Japan. So this is the period where the majority of Japan were it was still indigenous people living there. Um, and there's an image of someone with a bow, and it's being debated whether or not it's that below center grip bow or something like that. Um, but the way it's depicted is it's got a guy holding it just below the center,
Hmm,
and it's the bow is almost as tall as he is.
hmm,
So it's clear that if the horse archery stuff that the samurai were practicing in very, very, very early, very early on, was influenced by Korean horse archery from noble refugees who fled that kingdom. It's clearly borrowing a native bow design
yeah.
because, as you say, on the mainland, it's a lot more influenced by the cultures on the mainland. So, yeah, it's interesting for sure. All right, mates. Hopefully, you found that video interesting and informative. Hopefully, this has sparked some interest to looking into these topics further. And also, obviously, a big thank you to my mate Nathan from Just a Bug as well for having this chat with me. This has been super, super interesting and informative for me as well. So, I'll do, guys, obviously link Nathan's channel, Just a Bug, in the description, as well as a link to his school as well, which is based in Sydney. So, if you're ever around Sydney side and you want to look at historical Korean martial arts, definitely check them out because they have a lot of fun. They do some great work there too. So, but as always, I will see you mates in the next video. Bye bye.